Welcome to Keto Life Support, where we make your keto life sustainable, fun, and low stress. I'm Kim Howerton, and I'll be coming to you weekly with some of my keto besties to bring you the practical, real-world keto advice that you need. Quick disclaimer, I am not a doctor, and even if we do have a doctor in the house from time to time, he or she is not your doctor, and nothing we say on this show should be taken as medical advice. Always check in with a trusted medical professional about your own personal medical concerns. Hello, this is Kim Howerton, and I am here with another episode of Keto Life Support. This is episode number 144. We're going to talk about the various styles of keto. It's going to be exciting. Stay tuned. First, I'm just going to go more historically. I was like, how do I want to organize these? Like carb number or I don't know. But I'm going to go a little more historical in the path. And first, we've got what I would call more the traditional or the therapeutic ketogenic diet. And this was developed for epilepsy. Now, there's lots of discussion around like, was the first ketogenic diet developed for epilepsy? Or was it like banting and weight loss and all that? But I'm going with, the word ketogenic, and that really was around epilepsy a very long time ago. And at first, that diet, there was a real emphasis on high fat, and those people needed, or often children, although children are people, needed to make sure to have very high ketones. And the way to ensure that was to do what is referred to often as a 4-to-1 or a 3-to-1 ratio of fat to protein and carbs. So 4 or 3 would be the 4 times the amount of fat as the amount of protein and carbs added together in terms of amount. So that is the therapeutic ketogenic diet. Now, I will say probably not a lot of people use that high a fat ratio anymore, except when prescribed specifically by a doctor. Even with epilepsy, they've moved most people to what is referred to as more of a modified Atkins approach. A modified Atkins approach is going to be more like a 1-to-1 ratio. As an example, if someone was eating like 120 grams of fat, that would mean their grams of carbs and protein together would add up to 120. That's a 1-to-1 fat and then carbs and protein on the other side, with the carbs being the far more minimal quantity compared to the protein. So a modified Atkins focuses on adding more protein, not on adding more carbs to the traditional approach to ketosis. They found that it was helpful, especially for growing children, to get more protein than the original therapeutic level of restriction allowed, because protein is essential for growth. So we've got a lot more people moving over to this modified Atkins approach. In the keto, more like health sphere, diet sphere, you don't hear modified Atkins used a lot as a term, but it is a popular terminology within the medical sphere, especially within the epilepsy world. So the keto diet that I came into as a weight loss approach was more of what they call like 75% fat, 20% protein, 5% carbs, right? In terms of your percent of calories. That's sort of what is often the historically popular from at least the 80s or 90s, or when was that? The 2000s version of a ketogenic diet, which is going to look a lot more like a modified Atkins. Then within the ketogenic sphere, we've got the targeted ketogenic diet. What does that mean? Well, this one is where someone is on more of a traditional ketogenic diet, in that they are having a higher fat amount and a very low carb amount and a moderate protein amount, but they would target adding carbs at certain times. So usually this is used in an athlete. So somebody who is going to be working out, and either before the workout, in the middle of the workout, or at the end of the workout, they would have some easily digestible carbohydrate to enhance their workout performance. So that's what that targeted ketogenic diet is for. If you are not an athletic person, not for you. Then there's the cyclical ketogenic diet, which is where essentially, I don't know how to explain this without judgment. I don't have judgment, but it will sound judgy. It's sort of like 6 days on and 1 day off, or most of the day on and then the evening off, right? Like carb backloading or things like that. It's cycling carbs into your diet somehow. And that can, for a lot of people, look like they have a cheat day or something like that, or a cheat meal. It's got this idea that you need to replenish your glycogen stores occasionally. But for the most part, I find the cyclical keto, like the targeted one, is more like I am precision targeting these carbs around a need, whereas the cyclical one is more, although some would say you need them, yeah, it's an argument. So people who are really attached to their carbs might want the cyclical approach. However, for a lot of people, they find that cyclical approach is just a way that keeps them stuck on the roller coaster, not the roller, the merry-go-round of craving carbs. And so you have to find the approach that works for you. If someone is mentally good with an occasional carb meal and they put them in their diet every once in a while and it works well for them metabolically and weight-wise and all that stuff, it's an approach. I would say this is the trickiest approach with the least support in my mind to using it. But that's what the cyclical ketogenic diet is. So far we've talked about the therapeutic ketogenic diet, which I'm not saying nobody does anymore, but it would be done in concert with a doctor, right? It's not something the general public would want to undertake. The modified Atkins approach, which is very similar to the sort of what I would call the traditional dieting ketogenic diet, the approach that people take on when they're trying to lose weight often, or what was sort of the prescribed weight loss when I first found keto around 2015. Then we've got the targeted approach, we've got the cyclical approach, and then more recently, we've come into a period where people are doing what I would call higher protein keto. So it's no longer that 75-25% of calories coming from fat, protein, and carbs. The protein amount is bumped up. It might be more like 65 fat, 30 to 35 protein, 0 to 5% carbs, or it might even be more like 50, 40, 10, so it's definitely a lot. It's still higher fat percentage wise of calories than protein, but the protein it's coming up. It's coming to meet it, right? And then you've also got a sister of that, which I would call high protein, low carb, which is not necessarily quite as high fat. So the fat might be 50% of the intake and the protein might be 35 to 40%, but a little more liberal on carbs. So that might be 10 or even 15%. I know, but you have to make those work out to 100 because you can't have more than 100 in percents, right? But things are a little fluctuation-y in there. So it's still a more substantial amount of fat than a low fat diet. For sure. It's not in any way low fat, but you're reducing the fat, increasing the protein, and possibly increasing carbs, but still keeping them in the low carb arena of under about 100 grams of carbs. So now we've got some more people that showed up to the party. We got carnivore and we've got ketovore. Carnivore, I think, has been around for actually quite some time. My friend Amber O'Hearn was doing carnivore a very long time ago, like decades. And it's an approach where you're selecting just animal foods. So, it would include meat, fish. I consider fish meat. I think any flesh of an animal is meat, but some people divide them up. Dairy is often included, eggs. So if it came from an animal, for a lot of people, it qualifies as carnivore. Now, some people will subset carnivore, like the lion diet, which is just ruminant meat, right? So you can subset it more, but they fall under the carnivore umbrella, which is animal products exclusively or mostly exclusively. Then we've got ketovore, which is very similar to what I would call carnivore-ish, which is, most of your food and nutrition is animal-based, but you might include a few condiments or a little bit of vegetable matter that agrees with you, like, a little sprinkle of herbs on your steak or some compound butter with herbs in it, or a few onions with your meal, or every once in a while you have a little bit of greens or something like that with your meal. But you're probably under like 10 grams of carbs on average a day in the ketovore. So it's kind of combining the word carnivore and ketovore, if that wasn't clear. So that's like sort of more of a liberal carnivore with accessories, right? And so just to review, pretty much the styles that are kind of discussed within the keto or low carb sphere are going to be the therapeutic ketosis, the modified Atkins, the traditional ketogenic diet. Traditional is like when, right? But that's sort of what we're looking at as that weight loss, 25% of calories. Then there's the targeted or the cyclical. There's the high protein keto, which has been more popular recently. There's carnivore, there's ketovore, and then there's some other terms that get thrown around that you might want to know about. The first of which is lazy keto. So lazy keto refers to not tracking, right? Because, sometimes when you're trying to know what you're eating, it's helpful to track your food. So put your food choices into some type of tracker. It will give you the macronutrients you got out of that. But if you're not going to track, some people call that lazy. Now, lazy comes with a lot of judgments and connotations. You don't have to take those on. It's just what people mean when they say lazy keto. Usually they'll say, well, I keep like a mental track of the carbs in my head, because you can't eat anything you want, not track it, and still call it keto. Probably. I mean, you can, but you'd be fairly inaccurate in that description. So lazy just means maybe I keep like kind of a running total of carbs, or I know what foods are very low carb and I just eat those foods. But lazy is the lack of tracking. Dirty keto. So there is sort of a connection that developed where people will talk about keto. Well, a keto diet simply refers to eating in a way that puts you in a state of ketosis, right? It actually doesn't say anything about the quality of the food that you eat. However, most people, not all people, for sure not all people, but most people who are doing a ketogenic diet have at least a desire to have somewhat good health. And they know that the food choices they make can impact their health ultimately. And so there definitely are a lot of people that when they say keto, they have an implication of a certain level of food quality, right? So it's where the words clean and dirty come in, which are kind of rough words to say. And we all draw, it's like pornography, right? We all draw the line at a different point. Pornography, obscenity. I think anyway, I don't know. How much cleavage do you feel comfortable showing is all I was thinking. Now that's a weird, I'm going to rewind this part. We all draw our border in a different place when we're talking about like clean versus dirty, good versus bad. It's very, very judgmental all of a sudden in here. But the idea is, so like the other day I posted a recipe and it had an ingredient in it that, was it dairy? I can't even remember what the ingredient was. I was so confused. I put up that I, ate this meal and somebody was like, oh, you're dirty keto. And I was like, pardon? Because it was a meal that I was like, that is very no, I don't think of that as dirty. That's weird. But to them, the inclusion of this one ingredient was dirty. I think it was bacon. So we all might draw our line in a different way, but the general discussion of the dirty versus clean is dirty doesn't care about the ingredients. So it can include things that a lot of people say is off limits for keto, like sugar, as long as there's just a little. It can include wheat, as long as it's the kind that is low in net carbs. So I don't care what the ingredients are. I just need to be in ketosis, right? Whereas when people will talk about clean keto, it's sort of like a little bit of paleo interjected into your keto, right? Good quality sourced ingredients, more whole foods, less highly processed foods, sort of a paleo version of keto version of paleo. Anyway, one or the other. And that actually leads me to something which is net carbs versus total carbs. Those are two different ways of approaching keto, because some people track total carbs and some people track net carbs. What are total carbs versus net carbs? Total carbs are all the carbs in a food, and net carbs is the sum of carbs remaining after you remove fiber and sugar alcohols from the total amount. So it's the net, what's remaining after you remove those. So why do people do total carbs versus net carbs? Well, net carbs is a concept that was developed with the idea that we don't absorb all of the calories and carbs from high fiber, from fiber, right? From certain types of carbohydrates. They're not absorbed. They just go through our system, so they shouldn't count. The problem with counting net carbs from my perspective, not to be too opinionated, is that one, it's not actually true that there's only one type of fiber. Some types of fiber are absorbed versus excreted, entirely. And so we do absorb some calories and some carbohydrates from certain types of fibers. And so to just discount them wholesale is going to cause some problems, especially if you lean heavily on those types of foods. The second one is that the manufacturers now have taken complete advantage of the net carb loopholes and are calling things fiber that are certainly not fiber. Well, I mean, except they're fiber in name. You can chemically call it that, but your body seems to recognize it as sugar. And so there are net carb products that are pretty much as blood sugar impactful as regular standard sugar. So you have to be very, very cautious if you want to play the net carb game. I call it net carb roulette. A lot of people, myself included, tend to hang out on the total carb side of town. So I think that covers most of the approaches that you're going to interact with in the keto sphere these days. We've got the therapeutic approach where your primary desire is high ketones, higher fat is going to happen in there. You've got the modified Atkins leading to what I call more the traditional keto, the targeted, the cyclical, the high protein approach, carnivore, ketovore. We had some special visitors with discussing lazy, dirty, clean, net carbs, and total carbs. And then, I will mention that even in the carnivore community, there is the debate of high fat versus lower fat, which is that some carnivores will be more like 1-to-1 fat to protein ratio in terms of grams. Other carnivores might lean towards there's a group out of Hungary that does carnivore way of eating. I think they used to be called paleomedicine. I don't know if they still go by that name, but they advocate a very high fat approach, which is more like 2-to-1, 2 times the grams of fat to 1 gram of protein, which is kind of getting back to that therapeutic level of ketones. So that is your tour of this land. So hopefully that was helpful for some of you, getting to know some of the terms, what they mean. My personal experience was that I started at that more 75, 25, 5, which I'm calling traditional because it's my tradition, right? And then over time found I did much better with more protein. I ramped up the protein. I think most people do better with more protein. That way, 20% of your calories from protein. The problem with percent of calories, I don't do percents. I know I discussed them in today's discussion because people use them to describe various approaches. I think if you're using percents to determine your diet, you might be leading yourself astray because on a hungry day versus a not hungry day, that number of grams can really vary. And so I pay more attention to grams than percentages, but from one person to another, grams are going to vary. So that's why I'm discussing percentages. But I found that 20% of my diet from protein was insufficient protein to maintain my lean body mass and give me the macros that I needed and the nutrients that I needed. So bumping up protein was one of the best things I did. I did it over several years throughout my ketogenic journey. And then I did it again when I went what I would call more high protein. And so for me, protein's been a big central focus, but there are some people that do better on a slightly higher fat approach. And so it's a party and we're all a little different. So I want you to know about these various approaches so that you can be educated when people talk about it and help you know that keto is it's not just one thing. So if you have questions about any of these approaches, you want me to go more into depth about any of these approaches, the pros and cons, what I suggest, I would say, please let me know. You can write me a comment here on YouTube in the comment section. Just write me a comment, ask me a question, share your experience of how you've approached these various diet approaches. That was a really poorly worded sentence. I apologize. And I'd love to hear from you. So subscribe, make a comment, makes me happy, appreciate it, and I'll see you very soon.
Thank you so much for joining us for this episode of Keto Life Support. Want more information? Want show notes? Want to suggest a topic? Just head over to ketolifesupport.com. That's where all that kind of thing can go on. By the way, I have a request. If you could go to your podcast host and hit subscribe, we would really, really appreciate it. And what would be even more awesome is if you could write a review. And what would be even more awesome than that is if you could write a really flattering review. Just asking. You do you. All right. So thanks so much for joining us. I'm thrilled that you're part of the Keto fam. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.